Miami Dolphins have had a rough start to the 2025 NFL regular season, with losses to the Colts, Patriots, and Bills that have put them down 0-3 through the first 3 weeks of the season. You could say the Dolphins have a lot of concerns. Concerns with coaches Mike McDaniel and defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, quarterback Tua Tagovailoa, wide receiver Tyreek Hill, general manager Chris Grier, and the defense as a whole. It feels like a reset point is coming for the Magic City's football squad, and it's coming very soon. So today, let's talk about how they got to this point and what the potential solutions are for fixing what feels like a broken franchise. This is Son of a Sports. Let's talk about the Miami Dolphins. So before we talk about the state of the roster, let's talk about what led to this point. And we have to go back 4 years. During the 2021 NFL regular season, the Dolphins, then coached by current Vikings defensive coordinator Brian Flores, started 1-0 before a serious rib injury in Week 2 in a 35-0 shutout loss to the Bills, sidelined quarterback Tua Tagovailoa for 3 games. Backup Jacoby Brissett stepped in as the Dolphins lost 3 straight games on top of that loss to the Bills. Tua returned in Week 6 against the Jaguars, where the Dolphins lost 23-20 to a Jacksonville Jaguars franchise that was winless so far in 2021, coached by the disastrous Urban Meyer, and currently undergoing a 20-game losing streak. Tua and the Dolphins lost the next 2 games, putting Miami at 1-7 on the year. The only thing Miami had to be proud of was their losses outside of Buffalo and Tampa Bay were relatively close-fought games. During this time, rumors began to circulate that Miami's coaching staff and front office were looking to make a move for then Texans quarterback Deshaun Watson, who was sitting out the year amid a current trade request from the Texans and dealing with legal troubles that I will not go into today. In Week 9, Tua was forced to miss the matchup against the Texans due to a hand injury. Backup quarterback Jacoby Brissett started for the first time since Week 5 and helped bring Miami something that they hadn't seen in 2 months, a win. The 17-9 win for Miami was one of the ugliest games the NFL had seen in a while, though, as both teams combined for 9 turnovers, good for the most an NFL game had seen in over 5 seasons. The following week, Tua was healthy, but the Dolphins and Brian Flores elected to start Brissett against the Ravens. Tua didn't come in until the second half, and that's where he completed a 64-yard pass to Albert Wilson to set himself up for a 1-yard rushing touchdown to clinch the win against the 6-2 Ravens. Miami won the next 5 games, sitting at 8-7 on the year. At that point in the Texans game, Miami decided that they weren't going to make any moves, shut down all rumors, and allow Tua and this team to not have drama to close out the year. And I think that was massive for him. Miami went on a massive winning streak. And in Week 17, a loss to the number 1 seeded Titans ended their playoff hopes. But after finishing 9-8 with a closing win against the playoff-bound Patriots, there was hope for the future of the franchise. The 2022 offseason started with a shocker for the Dolphins as they elected to fire coach Brian Flores. It didn't really make any sense. They just finished 9-8 in 2 straight football seasons, despite a lack of talent on both sides of the ball. The team just finished 7-1 to finish the season. What is the problem here? Well, reports came out about multiple issues where Flores, for one, was not a fan of Tua, berated him on multiple occasions, and also reports came out about how the Dolphins treated Flores and how they asked him to do things he was not comfortable with. Owner Stephen Ross meddled and openly asked Flores to tank and threatened his job in doing so. Flores would eventually go on to sue the NFL for discrimination, and I think he's still currently in that lawsuit. The Dolphins had to make a choice: continue with their QB that finished 7-1 and had struggles through his first 2 years in the league, or go with another rebuild, or go after Deshaun Watson like Flores wanted. The Dolphins and GM Chris Grier stuck with Tua, hiring 49ers offensive coordinator Mike McDaniel, who coached the 49ers into a late playoff push en route to an NFC Championship appearance. And on day 1, McDaniel made it clear Tua was his guy, and he believed in Tagovailoa to be one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL. The Dolphins wanted to make that 9-8 roster into one that could make the playoffs the following year. So McDaniel and Grier got to work. The Dolphins, at the start of free agency, signed all-pro left tackle Teron Armstead to a 5-year deal. And they knew that he would have some injuries throughout that time, so they trusted that first-round pick Austin Jackson could come in for him and help make up for that role. Then they signed Cowboys guard Connor Williams and moved him to center. He had a lot of penalties with the Cowboys and had his struggles there, but there was hope that moving to center could really balance his game out. They brought in former Seahawks tackle Brandon Shell to start at right tackle for the year. To add to the receiver room, they added another Cowboy and wide receiver Cedric Wilson, who was coming off a 600-yard season as the Cowboys' 4th and then 3rd receiver after Michael Gallup went down late in the season against the Cardinals. The Dolphins then made another big move, one of the biggest of the offseason. You see, Chiefs all-pro wide receiver Tyreek Hill and the Chiefs could not agree to a long-term deal. So the Chiefs gave Tyreek an option: go to the Jets or go to the Dolphins, in trades that they already agreed to with both teams. And Tyreek chose the Dolphins on a 4-year, $120 million deal that set the record for the most money for a wide receiver in the league at the time. The Dolphins would send the Chiefs their 49ers 2022 first-round draft pick that they were owed from the Trey Lance trade, their own second-round pick from 2022, a 2022 fourth-rounder, and then a 2023 fourth and sixth-rounder. Going into the 2022 season, the vibes were hot in Miami. The Dolphins were ready to prove to everybody that they were ready to contend, that Tua was an elite QB, that Tyreek didn't need Mahomes and the Chiefs, and that he was worth every bit of that extension, and that Coach Mike McDaniel was the right guy for the job. A win in Week 1 against the Patriots and an unreal comeback and shootout in Week 2 against the Ravens that saw Tua throw 6 touchdowns and almost 500 yards had the Dolphins at 2-0. Week 3 saw the Bills come into Miami, the divisional Bills that dominated Miami in the Tua era so far, and the game ended up being a close loss for the Dolphins that scared the back-to-back AFC East champion Bills. But the story of the game at the end was a butt punt that Thomas Morstead did, when in reality it should have been the sack that saw Tua get up and almost stumble back over and fall back to the ground. Because the following week, the Dolphins had a Thursday night game against the Bengals. And the Dolphins said Tua, whatever happened in that incident, was just a back issue, but he was good to go for that Thursday night game. But on a sack on Tua towards the end of the first half, one that looked safer than the one he suffered just 4 days ago, the stadium and every viewer watching on their TV sat there in shock. In a moment of horror, Tua Tagovailoa was stunned on the ground and could not get up for 7 minutes. The quarterback was carted and taken to the hospital to get treated for neck and head injuries. It was horrifying. It was a moment that anybody watching has continued to remember and bring up to this day. Luckily, he seemed to be okay and just needed a few weeks to rest his head. In Week 7, Tua returned. The Dolphins were 3-3 on the year and needed their franchise guy back badly. In his first game back, Tua guided the Dolphins to a 16-10 victory over the Steelers, kicking off a 5-game winning streak for the Dolphins. The Dolphins were 8-3, and the vibes could not be any better. In Week 13, the tides did shift against the Dolphins' favor. Miami lost to the 49ers in Brock Purdy's first ever game and saw Tua throw for 2 picks after only throwing 3 in his 9 other games in the year. In that game, Brock Purdy came in for Jimmy Garoppolo, who had a season-ending injury, and a rookie, last pick of the draft, beat the Dolphins. That loss kicked off a 5-game losing streak for Miami. And that 5th loss that put the Dolphins at 8-8 on the year, disaster struck again, because against the Packers, Tua's head hit the ground on a sack towards the end of the first half. And during that second half, Tua did not look like himself whatsoever, calling into question if he was concussed. The third quarter saw the Dolphins just attempt a field goal after a long 10-play drive that didn't ask Tua to be anything other than a guy that hands off and just quick passes to the running back. The fourth quarter, that asked Tua to do more and had 3 separate possessions for the Dolphins, saw Tua throw 3 picks in those possessions. The Dolphins quickly announced after the game that Tua was concussed and going into protocol. The Dolphins were able to win against the Jets 11-6 to finish 9-8, enough for a playoff appearance. No news really came out about Tua other than that he would be ruled out for the Dolphins' first playoff appearance since 2016. He wasn't practicing, no reports of press conferences or working out. A few months later, in March 2023, shortly after the Dolphins picked up the 5th-year option for Tua, he spoke to the media for the first time since the injury. And in that press conference, Tua said he considered retirement because of the head injuries, that he was training in the offseason to land better so he wouldn't land on his head. The Dolphins were limited with their 2023 draft picks due to the Tyreek Hill trade, a midseason trade in 2022 where they gave up another first-round pick for defensive end Bradley Chubb, a former top 5 pick who struggled to stay healthy since his rookie season in 2018. And they also lost a pick because the NFL was punishing the Dolphins for colluding and trying to get former New Orleans Saints head coach Sean Payton and Tampa Bay Buccaneers quarterback Tom Brady, a punishment that was bestowed on them in the 2022 offseason right before they hired Mike McDaniel. Despite all of this, the 2023 offseason saw the Dolphins again make a lot of moves. The Dolphins signed Raheem Mostert to bolster the running back room. They signed linebacker David Long from the Titans, a move that was praised by diehard NFL analysts. The Dolphins then traded for all-pro corner Jalen Ramsey, getting him on a cheaper deal as the Rams and him were ready to move on, and they granted him a trade to wherever he'd want to go. The Dolphins also hired former Broncos head coach Vic Fangio to be their defensive coordinator. And if you don't know Fangio, he's the current defensive coordinator for the Eagles and their dominant run to the Super Bowl where they blew out Kansas City. 2023 was an amazing year for the Dolphins all around. Miami went 11-6 en route to another playoff appearance. The Dolphins finished first in yards, second in touchdowns, last in pressures allowed, and first in rushing yards per play. The Dolphins saw running backs Raheem Mostert and rookie Devon Achane produce one of the most balanced rushing attacks in the league. And even though Achane only played a certain amount of games that year, he was still dominant in those games. Tua threw for 4,600 yards, 29 touchdowns, 14 picks, and completed 69% of his passes. Tyreek was the top receiver in the NFL that season, and a contender for MVP. The Dolphins did have some struggles down the stretch, specifically in their upset loss to the Titans, who were 4-8 going into that game. The Dolphins were 9-3 in that, and they finished 2-2 in their final 4 games to finish 11-6. That Titans loss specifically in 2023 is where a lot of Dolphins fans have pointed out the beginning of the end of the McDaniel-Tua era. Anyways, Dolphins made the playoffs, and Tua was playing this time. The Dolphins were facing the defending Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs, who struggled through large parts of that regular season, specifically on offense. There was a stereotype, though, for Dolphins in cold games, and that stereotype came alive that day. The temperatures in Kansas City that Saturday night were the 4th lowest in an NFL game ever. The Dolphins' season ended in a 26-7 loss that saw the offense completely shut down. But a thing to note about the Dolphins roster towards that end stretch of the year, they were missing multiple guys across the board, specifically their pass rushers, and Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips, with Chubb tearing his ACL towards the end of the year and Phillips tearing his Achilles later down that stretch. It felt like the team was depleted and falling apart every new game in that final stretch of the regular season. As great as 2023 was for the Dolphins, injuries were their biggest weakness. But that 2024 offseason was one that saw Miami have to make some key changes because of their lack of money and their spending. They're spending all around over the last previous years. Pro Bowler Christian Wilkins, who was probably the most important guy on their defense in 2023, left to the Raiders in what was considered the biggest deal of the offseason that year. Starting center and key part of the offense of the last 2 seasons, Connor Williams, left as well. And Williams was another notable injury that occurred for the Dolphins towards the end of 2023, and one that I saw multiple Dolphins fans say, yeah, nothing's happening this year without him. Outside linebacker, Andrew Van Ginkel, a guy that really stepped up when Bradley Chubb and Jalen Phillips went down, left to the Vikings. And Brandon Jones, a strong safety that was really coming into his own in that Fangio system, left to the Broncos. But the Dolphins did and were able to make some decent moves. Tua signed a 4-year, $212 million extension with the Dolphins. Not saying that's a move I necessarily agree with, but a move that was big for Miami. Preventing them from moving on without taking dead cap for several years, though, with Tua. Locking them into having Tua as their quarterback for a while without taking on a massive dead cap. The Dolphins, with their first-round pick in the McDaniel era, or their first first-round pick in the McDaniel era, added edge rusher Chop Robinson. The Dolphins signed Jordan Brooks to fill up that linebacker role. They signed receiver Odell Beckham Jr. from the Ravens, who was not bad as the number 1 to number 2 guy for Lamar Jackson in large parts that year in 2023. And tight end Jonnu Smith from the Falcons, and what I believe was the first signing of that offseason. Coordinator Vic Fangio wanted to go be near his family in Pennsylvania, and it was clear he just wasn't meshing well with the guys in the locker room, so they granted him permission to go to the Eagles, and they hired defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, current defensive coordinator Anthony Weaver, who was a very, very, very respected position coach with the Ravens. The first game of 2024 saw the Dolphins beat the Jaguars in a close win, but it was a low-scoring game and one that presented problems for the Dolphins' future. But that Thursday night game, the following week, the first one of the season in the 2024 NFL regular season, saw the Dolphins take on the Bills. And the Bills quickly made things in a blowout by the end of the second quarter, but the third quarter was the biggest blow to Dolphins fans. On a run, Tua was tackled by safety Damar Hamlin and hit his head on the turf after hitting his head on Hamlin's pads, and Tua motioned the same way he did against the Bengals on that Thursday night in 2022. Tua was taken out of the game, and it was clear it was another concussion for the Dolphins quarterback. Over the following weeks, fans and analysts across the sport called for Tua to retire. Tua returned 6 weeks later, with the Dolphins sitting at 2-4 on the year. Although Anthony Weaver had the defense showing more than they had in 2023 with Fangio, the offense was nowhere near the same with or without Tua. And certain players on defense were not playing to the level that they had in previous years, specifically Javon Holland. The Dolphins saw a lot of their injured guys return but struggled to make an impact. With Tua in their last 11 games, the Dolphins went 6-5 to finish 9-8 on the year, just missing the playoffs. Tyreek Hill's game sort of fell off. Waddle and Mostert struggled with injuries, and Mostert did not play the same way he did in 2023, but Tua was solid in those 11 games. In the Dolphins' final game of the year, Tyreek Hill disappeared in the second half and made it clear to the media he wanted to change. He said, "I'm out."
This is my first time I haven't been in the playoffs, man. So, I mean, for me, like I said, man, I just got to do what's best for me and my family, dog. If that's here, if that's wherever the case may be, man, I'm finna open that door for myself, dog. As I'm opening the door, like I'm out, bro. You know, so it was great playing here, but you know, at the end of the day, bro, I got to do what's best for, you know, for my career and, you know, what's best. Because I'm too much of a competitor to be, you know, just out there.
And that offseason saw the Dolphins try to steady the ship for 2025. No firings, no major changes other than one trade. You see, the Dolphins and Jalen Ramsey agreed to split ways as the Dolphins needed to free up future money still, and Ramsey wanted to change the scenery. The Dolphins also told Jonnu Smith that they didn't have the money to extend him long-term, so Jonnu was ready to be moved. In a surprising player swap trade, the Dolphins traded Jalen Ramsey and Jonnu Smith to the Steelers for safety Minkah Fitzpatrick, whom the Dolphins originally drafted in 2018. The Dolphins went on to draft Kenneth Grant in the first round and extended Zach Zeeler, bolstering their defensive line. One more thing to note, Teron Armstead, their all-pro left tackle I mentioned that they signed in 2022, also announced his retirement. He was a steady piece of this entire team throughout their run over the last 3 seasons, but injuries mounted up. He's an older player, and he called it quits. Miami had a potential backup plan in Houston, Patrick Paul, and he has stepped in so far. Obviously, he's not Armstead, but Armstead was such a key piece of this offense, and losing him was just a major loss. Now we're here, and the Dolphins are 0-3 in 2025. Tua doesn't look like the same player. Tyreek doesn't necessarily look like the same player, but there's times where you still see it in him and see that maybe on a different team, he could be that same player. The defensive back room is absolutely atrocious. The defensive line hasn't looked anywhere near worth the level of investment Miami has put into it. And all around, Miami has looked completely dysfunctional and like a lost franchise. I went through the entirety of the backstory for 3 reasons. Number 1, Miami has proven it can turn around difficult seasons. So maybe we're all overreacting and Miami can build a foundation for the future with their guys, everyone involved for the rest of this season. Number 2, mostly to give perspective as to why Miami got to this point and why I think it's important the Dolphins go into a new direction. Yeah, my point number 1 was that maybe we're all overreacting, but my belief today is that Miami needs to go into a new direction. Number 3, connecting back to reason number 2, I wanted to show that I think Miami has reached its peak in the Tua era during the 2023 season when they lost to Kansas City. I don't think the Dolphins can build a roster as talented as the one they had in 2023, even if they tried. Even with the injuries that occurred, I believe that Miami just doesn't have the money, cap flexibility, or draft capital as of today to build a sustainable roster, even comparable to 2023, let alone one that can build a Super Bowl while also keeping guys like Tyreek, Bradley Chubb, Minkah, even Zach Zeeler, and Tua Tagovailoa. The Dolphins were originally able to contend because they traded pieces such as Laramie Tunsil for 2 firsts, with one of those turning into 3 more firsts. The original Minkah trade brought in a first-round pick. The Dolphins turned an awful roster in 2019 with a new head coach into a 10-6 roster in 2020 and a 9-8 roster in 2021, largely thanks to Brian Flores' coaching. And thanks to those 3 firsts in 2020, 2 seconds in 2020, 2 firsts and 2 seconds in 2021. That mostly came from dealing Laramie Tunsil, Minkah Fitzpatrick, and the Trey Lance trade that the Dolphins eventually turned into Jalen Waddle, Tyreek Hill, and Bradley Chubb, combined with just a few other assets. I'm not saying Miami can get those same assets again. I don't even think a team could. I don't know how long it'll be till we see a team acquire as many first-round picks as Miami did in that 2-year span. But I am saying this. This roster was built on a rebuild that started with a brand new head coach, getting a brand new quarterback, and a brand new roster. A rebuild that saw several talented players traded in pursuit of more draft picks. A rebuild that started with the admission that a quarterback like Ryan Tannehill wasn't enough to win a Super Bowl with the current caliber of a roster. I think a large part of this falling apart is financial planning, poor financial planning. But I think one of the biggest, if not the biggest reasons for this Dolphins era not working out is that Tua Tagovailoa is just not the quarterback to win a Super Bowl with. You can blame the concussions, you can blame the injuries, you can blame his physical limitations. Whatever you want to blame it on, you can do that. But what are the solutions today? Well, I think solution number 1 is pretty obvious. Move on from Tyreek Hill. I think Tyreek Hill just doesn't fit with this franchise right now. I think in January when he said he was out, he really was out. Tua said so himself that right now the guys are struggling to trust Tyreek again. That there is a disconnect there. And I feel like every other week there's another trade conversation happening with him because of his reactions to the game, because of him being mad on the sideline, because of what he said in January. He was a captain every single year. He's been there all 3 years until year 4. You want to know why? Because the guys don't trust him. This is not even talking about who he is as a human being, which is an awful human being, but this team doesn't fit with Tyreek Hill anymore. Number 2, if things look bleaker closer to the deadline, I think exploring the values of Bradley Chubb and Minkah Fitzpatrick and veterans like them are very much on the table. There are already rumors today that Bradley Chubb could be on the move because teams could be interested in him due to injuries on their defensive lines, specifically the 49ers. Minkah Fitzpatrick isn't going to get you a first-round pick. He's just not. He was a throw-in a trade for Jalen Ramsey, old Jalen Ramsey, and Jonnu Smith. But he could get you some assets. Same thing as Bradley Chubb. He's not going to get you a first-round pick, but he could get you maybe a third. And at the end of the year, I think the biggest thing you have to say is you need to move on from Chris Grier and Mike McDaniel. Mike McDaniel is a good play caller, and he'll get a coordinator job as soon as his time is done with the Dolphins. And I hate calling for people's jobs. I hate it. This affects people's lives, their families, their kids, their wives. They have to move. They have to uproot their lives and go to a new place. They settle into these towns, and it sucks. These are real people we talk about. But Mike McDaniel and Chris Grier, it feels like their time has run out in Miami. I feel like Mike McDaniel specifically just looks like he's drained and done with this job. They have tried and tried again. And I think once that new regime comes in, if they do it, which I think they should, they have a decision to make. And personally, I would consider the difficult decision to cut or maybe trade Tua Tagovailoa for the pursuit of a true reset. This roster needs purging for a chance to compete again. And it's not to say they don't have talented pieces. They do. They have young talented pieces. Jalen Waddle, Malik Washington, Devon Achane, Patrick Paul. On their defense, Jalen Phillips, if I hope to God he eventually gets healthy. Chop Robinson, Kenneth Grant. There are pieces there to like and be confident about in the long term. But there are so many others that are just weak right now. And I think top level draft picks would have to fix that. And they have the assets to at least put themselves in a position where they can start a rebuild. They're not going to get the first round picks they got last time. But there is a real chance for Miami to build something again in, let's say, 2 to 3 years if they commit today to a rebuild. There are a few things to note when it comes to moving off of Tua. Number 1, he has a trade dead cap of around $13 million. So maybe if a team is desperate at the end of the year, they could go and trade for him. I don't know what that market looks like. I don't know if it'll be worth moving off of Tua, if new regime or not. I think they should. But the league is going to look completely different at the end of the Super Bowl than it does today. There will be teams that are looking for a quarterback that weren't looking for a quarterback today. Number 2, I think the dead cap for Tua is way too much for this year, but it could be something if Stephen Ross is willing to make that financial commitment that can be done. It's a $79 million dead cap, and we just saw a team like the Broncos put themselves in contention in a 2-year span, yes, with pieces, by cutting Russell Wilson and getting off that dead cap money in 2 years instead of just holding out. I don't think the Broncos get off that dead cap till next offseason. And the final thing is, I keep saying, the Dolphins are in need of a reset, and that includes Tua. Dolphins blogs will tell you that. Dolphins fans will tell you that. They need to move on for both Tua and the Dolphins. We saw Tannehill and the Dolphins agree to move on, and it worked out for both parties. I think the same thing can be done here, and it's time. It was time a year ago, and it's time today. It's only week 3, so there are 17 games to be played in a season. Things could entirely change, but there have been telltale signs for the last few years that there were problems in Miami, that this window was closing. And last year, it felt like the window was closed and that changes needed to be made. And those changes weren't made. And today, the Dolphins are 0-3. we'll see what happens. The Dolphins have an easier schedule over the next few weeks. Things could change in their record, but I don't think things are going to change in terms of them winning a Super Bowl. So that's my take today. If y'all have any thoughts, comments, let me know down below. Subscribe. This is Son of a Sports. I'll catch y'all next time.